In the weeks since the federal shutdown started, we've seen strains in our national parks, we've seen strains in our air travel. Less visible, however, is a strain put on our cybersecurity workforce. Earlier today, I talked with Darien Kindlund of Inside Engines just to see exactly how the shutdown affects our federal cybersecurity.
We're in day 21 of the shutdown, and it's really affecting the civilian agencies a lot more than DoD or the military organizations. Specifically, what we've seen is that these teams focused on security, IT operations on the civilian side are really operating under the notion of a skeleton crew. And that's proven to be very difficult, as we've started to see in this environment. In terms of maintaining systems, monitoring, just simple things like availability is a challenge right now for a lot of teams.
So right now, are we more at risk?
Absolutely. I'd say anytime you're dealing with a less than full staff, especially when it goes to security and IT operations, you start running into issues associated with just maintaining current operations. In fact, we've seen recently that some infrastructure is now going offline because things like certificates are expiring on public websites that are used for delivering government services.
One way of looking at it is there are less people in offices, there's less people checking their email. You're not going to get phished if you don't check your email.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But if you think about a full attack lifecycle, what we've seen over time is that many attackers, they're very methodical about compromising an organization, and they'll actually use this time, if they already have a foothold in these organizations, to enact further damage in terms of lateral movement, in terms of exfiltration of data, or gaining further access, because they know that there's less monitoring going on during this time.
Your company, Inside Engines, is in a way a browser where you get to ask questions of your own cybersecurity in plain English, almost like a Google for your own network.
Absolutely.
What's the first question that someone should be asking in the federal government of their cybersecurity?
Really, it's about going back to basics. When you're trying to recover in terms of scaling up operations, you need to level set what your baseline operations look like in terms of who made changes to systems during this time frame, who was actually active, was that normal, was that expected, what sort of network traffic was generated during this time frame, where was it going, was there any systems that were not available during this time because of lapse in maintenance that need to be brought back online. Those really follow the critical security controls for the most part.
Darien, as we've seen, there are a lot of federal employees and their families who are struggling right now. They're not going to work or they're not getting paychecks, and times are really tight. They're very desperate. Could they be at risk for any kind of cybersecurity intrusion in their personal lives?
Absolutely. In fact, any major event, any major current event is used by many different scammers, people that are willing to steal information as a lure to get victims to disclose further information about their environment. So it is a risk, and we would recommend any worker who is affected during the shutdown to be very vigilant about the sorts of offers that they get to make sure that they're not fraudulent.
As we see with TSA screeners in our national airspace, there's a little bit of complacency. They're not at full morale. Are we seeing something similar with the federal IT workforce?
We're starting to see certain elements of that, and it's unfortunate. A lot of times, many of these workers have developed automation to help keep the lights on for this infrastructure. However, even in that scenario, there are always unexpected problems, fixes that require teams to look at manually. And that's really the risk that we're introducing during this time.
Thank you. And eventually the government's going to get back to business. So what are some of the questions that federal IT workers should be asking to get the government back in business and back secure the way they want it to be?
It's really a great opportunity for a lot of security teams to take a look at the activity that occurred during the shutdown to understand, is this normal baseline activity or not? And use that as a comparison point to determine, is there any unauthorized activity that has now occurred, and it's easier to see because there's less background activity during that time. So we recommend that security teams take a look at all of the activity that's occurred during these past 21 days to determine if there's any outliers in terms of network activity, even usage of endpoint or infrastructure, to determine is there any signs of an intrusion that has already taken place during this time.
The military is fully funded right now and they're getting paid, except for the Coast Guard. Does that bring up some sort of risk?
It does, in the way that the Coast Guard is part of DHS, and there is usually healthy information sharing amongst Coast Guard and DoD. So during this time, with a light or less than optimized staff at the Coast Guard, we would see less information sharing, which would introduce additional risk across our borders.
Darien, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.